The morning air was cool and still when he stepped out onto his porch, expecting nothing more than a quiet start to his day. The birds were barely awake, the sun was just creeping above the trees around the lake, and everything felt calm. That peace lasted about 20 seconds, because the first thing he saw was a bright red paper slapped right across his front door. It was the kind of paper that already made your stomach sink before you even read a word. He walked closer and peeled it off, thinking maybe it was some delivery notice or some public announcement. But the moment he saw the HOA seal on the top, he felt a sigh building in his chest. Anyone who lived under an HOA knew that nothing good ever came in a red envelope. He stood there, still half asleep, scanning the words slowly. The notice said he owed a $1,000 fine for something called unauthorized water structure usage. For a moment, he didn't even react. He just blinked at the page as if he had misread it. Unauthorized water structure usage. What did that even mean? He didn't have a pool. He didn't have a fountain. He didn't have anything weird built on his land. He only had the lake, the same lake his family had owned for decades. He read the line again, and once more just to make sure he wasn't imagining it. But the words didn't change. They were bold, sharp, and ridiculous. He glanced toward the lake, still quiet and perfect in the morning light. The idea of the HOA trying to fine him for something that existed long before the neighborhood did made him shake his head. He wasn't angry yet, just confused. He tried to imagine the conversation that must have taken place in the HOA office for someone to think, oh, this was a good idea. Inside, he set the paper on the table and made himself a cup of coffee, hoping maybe a few sips would make the situation make more sense. It didn't. If anything, it made him more aware of how strange the whole thing was. The notice said he needed to come to the HOA office within 7 days or the fine would increase. So after finishing his coffee, he grabbed the notice again, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and headed out. He wasn't the kind of person who liked confrontation. But he also wasn't the type to hand over $1,000 for absolutely nothing. The HOA office was a short walk away. As he approached, he could already see someone through the front window. A woman with sharp posture, tapping on a keyboard like the world owed her something. She was known around the neighborhood as someone who loved rules a little too much. People didn't use her name very often. They mostly referred to her as the one lady who always complained. Whether it was lawn length, mailbox color, or trash can placement, she always had something to say. He stepped inside the office and was greeted with the usual tight smile she gave everyone, the kind that felt more like a warning than a welcome. She didn't bother hiding her impatience. "Can I help you?" she asked, even though the bright red notice in his hand made it obvious. "Yeah," he said calmly. "I got this notice this morning. It says I'm being fined for unauthorized water structure usage. I'm hoping there's been some kind of mistake." She held out her hand and he gave her the paper. She skimmed it and nodded like everything made perfect sense. "Yes, that's correct. Correct," he repeated, not sure whether to laugh. "The lake is on my land." She lifted her chin. "The community considers it part of the shared natural view, and therefore it must fall within HOA guidelines. You're using the water structure in a way that isn't approved." He stared at her. "Using it how? I haven't changed anything. This lake has been here longer than any of these houses." He gestured toward the neighborhood. "It's not a community lake. It's private." Her expression tightened. "That may be what you believe, but as HOA president, I have authority to determine which elements of the environment affect the community space, and that lake does. So unless you pay the fine, additional penalties will apply." He waited for her to smile, or at least acknowledge how absurd this was. She didn't. She actually meant every word. "Look," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I don't want any trouble. I just want to clear this up. I have the deed. The lake is on my property. It's included in the land description. Unless you bring official documentation that states the HOA has no claim on it, the fine stands," she replied. "You have 6 days now." She was dismissing him before he finished speaking. Her tone made it clear she wasn't interested in facts. It's only control. He stepped out of the office with a mix of disbelief and irritation building in his chest. He wasn't angry the way someone gets angry in the heat of a moment. This was the slow kind of frustration that settles deeper because you know you're dealing with someone unreasonable. He walked back home along the path near the lake, the calm water reflecting the sky. It was almost funny, almost that anyone would try to claim something so clearly private. He crouched at the edge of the water, running his hand along the surface. This lake wasn't just an outdoor feature to him. It was part of his family's history. His grandfather had fished here. His father had taught him to skip stones on the shore. And he had spent countless quiet mornings right here. The idea that someone could show up decades later and say, "Actually, this belongs to us now," felt surreal. He knew one thing. He wasn't paying a fine. Not for something that wasn't wrong. Not because someone with a title wanted to throw her weight around by the time he reached his house. He already knew his next step. He pulled out his old box of documents from the hallway closet. The one filled with stored papers, maps, old surveys, and land records. His family had kept everything. Even papers from the 1960s that hadn't been touched in decades. He spread them out on the dining table, carefully flipping through each document. It took a while. But finally, he found the original property survey with a clear outline showing the lake fully inside the land boundaries. It wasn't even close to any HOA-controlled area. He placed his finger along the dotted line marking the edge of the property. Following it around the entire lake, there was no confusion, no ambiguity. The lake was unquestionably his. But then another thought crossed his mind. HOA disputes often needed newer documentation. Something recent. Something official. So he decided he would visit the county office the next morning and request updated land boundary confirmations. The next day, he drove to the county office with the old records in hand. The clerk there, unlike the HOA president, actually listened. She checked the maps, cross-referenced old files, and even went into the archives to pull up the original lake registry. After several minutes of checking, she looked up and simply said, "Yes, it's private." It's been private since it was registered. That sentence alone made him feel a wave of relief. Not surprise he expected this result, but relief that someone with actual authority had confirmed it. He asked for official copies, stamped and signed, and the clerk gladly handed them over. When he stepped outside into the sunlight again, he thought the whole situation would now be simple. He would show the HOA the documents. They would have no choice but to drop everything. But something in his gut told him it wouldn't be that easy. He knew the kind of person he was dealing with. Someone who didn't like being proven wrong. Someone who treated every rule as if it were her personal power. He wasn't wrong. When he returned home, there was another notice waiting for him. This one wasn't red. It was white, but it had bold letters across the top that said "Second warning. Fine had gone up." Not by a little, by $500 more. He stared at the number printed on the page. It felt unreal. He hadn't even had time to talk to them. They had already escalated the situation. He took a long breath and folded the paper neatly. Anger wasn't the right reaction. He understood that now. This wasn't a situation to react emotionally to. It was one to handle smartly. He looked out toward the lake again. The water was calm, the trees still. It was his land. His family's land. And he wasn't going to let anyone rewrite that. He didn't know it yet. But this was only the beginning of a long fight, one that would end very differently from how the HOA president expected. He took the new warning notice, placed it beside the stamped documents from the county office, and prepared to handle everything step by step, not with loud arguments. Not with anger, just with the truth. The next morning came with a heaviness he could feel even before he opened his eyes. Part of it was the second notice still sitting on his table, the one that tried to claim he now owed even more money. The other part was the simple realization that this was not going to be fixed with a short conversation or a quick explanation. People like the HOA president didn't bend easily. Sometimes they didn't bend at all. Still, he wasn't the type to give up early. He woke up, made himself a simple breakfast, and laid out all the papers he had gathered the day before. The stamped documents from the county office, the old survey, the lake registration papers, everything was clear, organized, and undeniable. He took a moment to breathe. He wasn't nervous. He just wanted to be steady. He had learned long ago that calmness was more powerful than anger, especially when dealing with someone unreasonable. As he stepped outside, he noticed the distant sound of voices. A few neighbors were out for their morning walks, and he could feel their eyes shifting between him and the notice still taped to his front door. News traveled fast in the neighborhood, and when it came to the HOA, it traveled even faster. He heard whispers, but nothing sharp or mocking. People looked curious, maybe a bit concerned. He walked over to the edge of the lake again. The peaceful ripples on the surface made him feel grounded. The lake had been part of his life long before any HOA rules existed. That alone gave him confidence. He tucked the documents into a folder and headed to the HOA office once more. As he walked in, the president glanced up with a stiff expression. She already seemed annoyed, as if she had expected him but hoped he wouldn't show. "Back again?" she said, her tone clipped. He nodded politely. "I have the official documents from the county. They confirm the lake is on my private property. I'd like the notices removed." She didn't reach for the folder. Instead, she leaned back in her chair with folded arms. "You may leave your papers. The board will review them when we have time." He opened the folder anyway and placed it on the desk gently. "It's pretty clear. The lake has been private land since it was recorded. There shouldn't be any fines at all, and definitely not an increase overnight." Her eyes narrowed. "Whether or not you believe it is private does not matter. The board has determined that your lake affects community property values and visual standards. Therefore, it falls under HOA oversight. The fines will continue until the matter is resolved." She flipped a paper on her desk as if she were already moving on. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence sit between them. He realized she wasn't just stubborn. She wasn't confused. This wasn't a misunderstanding. She was deliberately pushing her authority as far as she could. He picked up the folder slowly. "If the board needs time to review the documents, that's fine. But the fines should be paused until then." "They will not be paused," she said sharply. "And any refusal to pay will result in additional action." He didn't ask what additional action meant. He already knew she wanted him to ask so she could list threats. He simply nodded once and walked out. Outside, he closed his eyes for a moment. The sky was bright, but his mood wasn't. Not defeated, but aware. He needed a clearer, stronger direction. Something that didn't involve arguing with someone who enjoyed confrontation. He walked home slowly, thinking through the possibilities. He had proof now, but he could sense that the HOA president wasn't going to accept it easily. She wasn't interested in the truth. She was interested in control by the time he reached his house. He was beginning to accept that this situation needed more than paperwork. It needed backup. Something undeniable even to someone who lived in her own version of reality. So he made a decision. He would hire a licensed land surveyor, not a family document, but a brand new official evaluation. Something modern, stamped, and indisputable. He pulled out his phone and started searching for local surveyors. The first few numbers rang without answer. But finally he found a company that said they could send someone out later in the week. Actually, the voice on the other end said, "We had one cancellation this afternoon. If you want, we can come today." He agreed immediately. When the surveyor arrived, the man looked professional and neutral, not the type to get pulled into neighborhood politics. He introduced himself briefly, then went straight to work. He set up his tripod, measuring rods, other tools around the lake. As he watched the surveyor work, he felt a sense of reassurance. Facts didn't bend. Measurements didn't lie. And people like the HOA president couldn't argue with stamped legal results for the next couple of hours. The surveyor walked around the property boundary, occasionally stopping to take notes and capture coordinates. At one point, he asked a few questions about historical records and original markers. But mostly, he worked quietly. What he didn't expect was company. Halfway through the survey, he noticed two neighbors approaching. They weren't troublemakers. They were the kind who liked staying informed. They greeted him politely and then glanced toward the surveyor. "Is something going on with the property line?" one of them asked. He didn't see a reason to hide the truth. "The HOA tried to fine me for the lake. They're saying it falls under their control." Both neighbors looked shocked. "But the lake is yours," one said. "Everyone knows that." "Apparently not everyone," he replied with a small smile. The neighbors stayed for a few minutes, shaking their heads and muttering frustration about how the HOA had become too strict lately. They didn't speak badly about anyone directly. They didn't need to. Their reactions alone showed how ridiculous the situation looked from the outside. When the surveyor finally finished, he packed up his equipment and approached him. "Everything looks consistent with the county records," he said. "I'll finalize the report and deliver the stamped documents in 2 days." "Thanks," he said. "I appreciate it." After the surveyor left, he felt lighter, but only for a moment, because before he could even step inside his house, he heard a voice behind him. "What do you think you're doing?" He turned and saw the HOA president approaching, walking fast with a clipboard in her hand. She wasn't smiling. Her expression was sharp, full of irritation. "I saw a surveyor out here," she said. "You didn't request HOA approval for outside services." He blinked. "I don't need HOA approval for a land survey. It's my property." It is property that affects community space," she snapped back. "Any official work requires review. You're violating multiple protocols." He couldn't help but let out a short breath. Not laughter, just disbelief. "All he did was measure property boundaries," he said calmly. "There's no rule against that." She stepped closer, lowering her voice, like she wanted to make the moment feel heavy. "You're trying to challenge the board. That kind of behavior isn't appreciated here." He met her eyes. "I'm just proving what's already true." She opened her mouth again, but this time she didn't seem to know what to say. Her frustration was obvious, and he realized something. She wasn't angry because he broke rules. She was angry because he wasn't afraid of her rules. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps sharper than before. He exhaled slowly. The situation was growing bigger than he planned, but he wasn't backing down. Later that evening, he sat at the dining table again with a cup of tea, staring at the papers scattered across the wood. The house was quiet, but his thoughts weren't. He replayed the conversation with the HOA president in his mind, thinking about how easily she dismissed facts, how quickly she jumped to controlling the situation, how determined she seemed to be right, even when she wasn't. This wasn't a normal HOA dispute. This was someone who liked power more than fairness. And people like that didn't step aside, they doubled down, as the sun set over the lake outside his window. He decided he would not get pulled into emotional battles or loud exchanges. He knew who he was. He was patient, steady, and thoughtful. He solved problems with clarity, not chaos. He carefully gathered the documents again and placed them in a folder marked with the date. He wanted everything organized when the time came to present it, because deep down, he knew this was far from over. The HOA president wasn't going to drop the issue. She had already escalated the fine once, and she would probably do it again. But now, he wasn't just reacting, he was preparing for whatever the next step would be. Preparing for the meeting where he would bring every proof, preparing for the moment when even the most stubborn person would have no choice but to accept the truth. And somewhere inside him, a small spark of resolve grew stronger. If the HOA wanted to push, he could push back, but in the quietest, most controlled way possible, the kind of way that eventually made the truth impossible to ignore. He stood, looked out at the lake once more, and knew that the calm water wouldn't be disturbed, not by fines, not by false claims, and definitely not by someone who believed she could take away what his family had protected for generations. The fight wasn't finished. It had barely begun. He woke up the next morning hoping for a quiet day. But the uneasy feeling in his stomach told him that quiet wasn't going to happen anytime soon. The neighborhood had a strange energy in the air, like people were waiting for something to unfold. Nothing dramatic or loud, but more like a slow-moving storm that everyone felt even before it arrived. He brewed a cup of tea and stepped outside. The lake was calm, as if unaware of all the trouble people were trying to attach to it. A light breeze moved across the surface, making soft ripples that reached the shore. He stood there for a moment, taking in the peaceful scene and letting the quiet settle inside him. He needed that calm more than he wanted to admit. But as he turned to head back inside, he noticed something unusual. There were 3 small orange flags stuck in the ground near the edge of the lake. They weren't there yesterday. He walked over and examined one of them. It had a tiny printed label attached to the stick, pending review, community water zone. He let out a slow breath, partly in disbelief and partly in exhaustion. It was obvious who had put them there. And it meant one thing: the HOA president wasn't waiting for the survey results. She was pushing ahead with her own plans. He pulled the flags out. Not roughly, not angrily, just firmly, like removing something that didn't belong. He knew this action would probably irritate her. But the idea of leaving them there felt like giving up a small piece of his land. That wasn't happening. He placed the flags on the porch and headed inside. For a moment, he sat at his dining table, staring at the folder of documents from the county and the pending survey results that would arrive soon. He wanted to believe those would be enough, but deep down he knew she didn't care about documentation. She cared about winning. Still, he wasn't someone who folded easily. He decided to continue calmly and let each step happen at the right time. A few hours passed before he heard a knock on the door. A firm knock. Not angry, but purposeful. When he opened the door, 2 HOA board members were standing there. Not the president; these were other members he had seen around, but never really spoken to. They looked slightly uncomfortable. The taller one cleared his throat. "We were asked to check on a report that you removed official markers placed on common property." He raised an eyebrow. "Those flags were on my land. They weren't official anything." The second board member shifted awkwardly. "Well, we are supposed to confirm their removal." He reached to the side, grabbed the 3 orange flags he had pulled out that morning, and handed them over calmly. "Here they are. You can look at them. They don't have any permit numbers, no signatures, no authorization. They were just stuck in the ground." The board members examined them. The tall one frowned slightly. "These aren't official markers." "I know," he replied simply. The 2 board members exchanged a quiet glance. One of those looks where people communicate without speaking. He could tell they knew something wasn't right, but they also didn't want to get in the middle of a dispute with their own president. "Thank you," the taller member finally said. "We will report back." The 2 walked away slowly, looking less sure of themselves than when they had arrived. As he closed the door, he felt a mix of frustration and certainty. This situation was becoming more complicated by the day, and the president clearly wasn't working alone. But he also saw something else. Not everyone in the HOA agreed with her. Some were just following orders. That mattered. It meant her authority wasn't as solid as she wanted people to believe. Later that afternoon, he received an email from the surveyor. The final report was ready, stamped, signed, and complete. He drove to the office, picked up the envelope, and carefully checked each page. The diagrams were sharp and clear. The boundaries were precise. Every detail lined up with the county records. It was ironclad evidence. He drove home feeling hopeful. Maybe now the HOA president would finally have to back down. But when he pulled into his driveway, he saw something new taped to his front door. Another notice. He walked up to it slowly, already bracing himself. This one wasn't a fine. It wasn't a warning. It was a summons. Mandatory HOA hearing, property misuse investigation. Good date and time were written beneath it 3 days from now. He read the notice twice. He didn't feel surprised. Not anymore. Instead of trying to resolve things quietly, she was making it bigger. She wanted a show. A public confrontation. Something where she could try to embarrass him or pressure him into compliance. He removed the notice and took it inside. He sat down, folded his hands, and thought for a while. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about someone trying to control something that wasn't hers. And for the first time, felt something change inside him. Not anger. Exactly. More like a quiet, steady determination. He wasn't going to walk into that meeting unprepared. He wasn't going to argue with emotion or frustration. He was going to walk in calmly, with every piece of evidence, and let the truth speak louder than any claim the HOA president could make. But preparation wasn't just paperwork, it was strategy. So he called the county office again and asked for copies of all property-related correspondence. He emailed the surveyor requesting digital copies of the report. He sorted every document into labeled folders. He printed extra copies of everything. By the time he finished, the dining table looked like a small legal office. The next day, he noticed even more whispers among neighbors. People walked slower when passing his house. Some lingered near the sidewalk, glancing at the lake. A few even approached him during the day. One older man stopped him during his walk. "We heard there's an HOA hearing," he said quietly. "You know, a lot of people don't agree with how things are being run lately." Another neighbor, a woman with a soft voice, said, "The president has been pushing rules harder than ever. You're not the only one having issues." Conversations weren't dramatic or loud. They were small, almost cautious. But they revealed something important. The neighborhood wasn't blindly supporting the HOA president. Some were uncomfortable. Some were tired. Some were waiting for someone to stand up. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. He just wanted his land respected. But knowing he wasn't alone gave him more confidence that evening. Decided to walk to the far side of the lake, a place he rarely visited. It was quieter, hidden behind a line of tall trees. As he walked along the shore, he saw something unexpected. A freshly placed wooden stake in the ground, painted white. He approached it carefully. Another label hung from it, under review for community pathway extension. A pathway. He shook his head slowly, almost amused by how bold she had become. She wasn't just trying to claim the lake, she was acting as if she could plan new structures on it. He pulled the stake out of the ground and carried it home. This time, he didn't feel anger or exhaustion. He felt ready. The hearing was only 2 days away, and he already knew exactly how it would go. He wasn't walking in with arguments. He was walking in with facts. He wasn't walking in alone. The neighborhood was watching, and the HOA president, for all her power and confidence, had made one mistake. She underestimated the one person who wasn't afraid to challenge her. As he set the wooden stake beside the orange flags on his porch, he looked out at the lake lit by the fading evening sun. It looked peaceful. But beneath that calm surface, the fight was building, and he was ready for whatever came next. He woke up the next morning feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the last few days. The lake, the fines, the meetings, the unexpected support from neighbors, none of it felt real yet. It was like the calm before another storm, the quiet moment life gives before it throws something new your way. And deep down, he already sensed that the next round was coming. After washing his face and making a simple breakfast, he stepped outside onto the porch. A soft breeze moved across the lake, creating ripples that glimmered under the early sun. This place had always been a source of peace for him, a place where he could escape noise and pressure. But lately, the lake had become the center of a fight he'd never asked for. Still, he wasn't the kind of person to back away from what belonged to him, especially not when someone tried to twist the rules to gain control. Around mid-morning, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the neighbors who had stood by him the day before. HOA president is furious. "She's calling an emergency board meeting today. Thought you should know." He read it twice, then sighed. Of course, she was furious. Losing control, even a little, probably felt like the world collapsing for her. He pictured how she had stormed out of the last meeting, face tense and shoulders stiff. It wasn't hard to imagine her pacing around her living room right now, planning her next move. But he wasn't scared. Tired, maybe. Annoyed, definitely. But not scared. He responded with a simple thank you and slipped his phone into his pocket. If the HOA wanted another meeting, he'd show up. He had nothing to hide. A few hours later, he heard a car pull into his driveway. He stepped out of the house and saw a familiar truck. It was one of the older neighbors, someone who had lived near the lake for years. The man climbed out, holding a folder. "Thought you might want copies of these," he said. "What are they?" "Old maps. The original land plans before the HOA was even formed." Linked, surprised. "You kept these?" "Someone had to," the man said with a small shrug. "I figured one day these people would try to bite off more than they could chew." He thanked him sincerely, accepting the folder like it was a piece of gold. In a way, it was. Proofreal, old-fashioned proof of property lines and agreements. The HOA had no authority to change. The neighbor gave him a reassuring pat on the arm before heading back to his truck. "Don't let them push you around," he said. "You've been more patient than most." Patient. Yes, to patient, maybe. But patience had bought him time. And in that time, he had gathered enough to stand his ground. He spent the next hour looking through the maps. They were yellowed around the edges, creased from age, but still clear. And there it was, his lake, clearly marked as private property, separate from all HOA-controlled land. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. But he also knew this wouldn't magically fix everything. Some people refused to accept facts when they didn't match what they wanted. Just before sunset, he received another message. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight at 7. They want everyone to attend." Everyone. That meant she wasn't just coming after him. She wanted an audience. She wanted a stage. He took a slow breath, closed the folder, and placed it under his arm. If she wanted a stage, he'd walk right onto it. At 7 sharp, he arrived at the community center. Cars lined the street. People murmured as they walked inside. There was a tension in the air, the kind that made people stand straighter and look around more than usual. When he walked in, several neighbors greeted him quietly. Some nodded. Some whispered words of support. A few avoided eye contact, clearly not wanting to get pulled into anything. And at the front of the room stood the HOA president. She was already staring at him, arms crossed, posture stiff. She didn't speak as he entered, but her expression said enough. The meeting began, with her launching into a speech about community unity, rules being followed, and property boundaries needing to be respected. She said everything except the real reason she called the meeting. Finally, she paused, lifted a piece of paper dramatically, and said, "And that brings us to the situation involving the lake. A homeowner is refusing to follow HOA guidelines." Murmurs filled the room. He kept quiet, staying calm. She continued, "We issued a fine of $1,000. Not only was it ignored, but the homeowner openly challenged the board." Now people were whispering louder. He raised his hand. She hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "You may speak." He stood up slowly. "I didn't ignore anything," I responded. "And you're leaving out the important part: the lake isn't HOA property. It never has been." Shh. She immediately cut in. "That's not true." He stayed calm. "I brought proof." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. He opened the old folder and lifted the maps. "These are the original plans. Before the HOA existed, the lake is fully within my private property line." People leaned forward. The room fell silent. She frowned. "Old documents don't override updated community rules." He shook his head. "Community rules can't override county recorded property deeds. You can't change property lines. And the board knows that." A few people nodded in agreement. One neighbor stood up. "Is this true? The lake isn't ours to regulate?" The HOA president looked uncomfortable. "The board believed. Another neighbor interrupted, or assumed. Shifting murmurs filled the room. He held the maps out for people to see more clearly. "I'm not trying to fight anyone. I just want people to respect what's mine. I've never stopped anyone from walking near the lake. I've never complained about folks taking pictures or enjoying the view. But I won't let someone fine me for using my own property." That hit the room like a quiet shock, because it was simple, honest, human. A woman in the back spoke up. "Why did the HOA issue a fine at all?" Another neighbor added, "Yeah, what rule did he even break?" The president finally snapped. He modified landscaping without approval. He blinked. "Landscaping? I trimmed a few bushes on my lakefront. On my own land?" The room reacted instantly. Even people who didn't know him personally were now clearly on his side. Trimming bushes wasn't a crime, and everyone knew it, seeing her losing control of the room. The president straightened her back and said loudly, "The board stands by its decision." But nobody seemed convinced. He took a slow breath and said softly, "I've always respected this community, but respect goes both ways." A long silence followed. People looked at him, then at her, then at the maps. The president's jaw tightened. "We'll take this matter back for review." He nodded once. "Please do." The meeting ended with people crowding around him, thanking him for speaking up, asking questions, offering support. It felt overwhelming but comforting too. By the time he stepped outside into the cool night air, he felt lighter. The stars reflected off the quiet lake, almost like they were cheering him on. But as he walked home, he knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done. And the next step she took would be bigger, which meant his next step needed to be stronger. He looked at his lake calm. Steady, untouched him, whispered to himself, "This time, I'm ready." He woke up the next morning with a strange mix of calm and curiosity, as if the air itself was waiting to reveal what the day had planned for him. After everything that had happened from the first find to the heated meeting, the night before he expected the situation to simmer down for at least a day. But deep inside, he knew the HOA president wasn't the type to let anything go quietly still. Had his coffee, walked onto the porch, and watched the lake shimmer under the soft morning light. The water looked peaceful, more peaceful than it had in days. It almost made him wonder why people fought so hard for control when nature itself simply existed without needing anyone's permission. His phone buzzed on the porch railing. He picked it up lazily, expecting a message from one of the neighbors. It wasn't. It was a notification from the HOA portal. New notice issued. Monthly dues adjustment. He frowned and tapped it open. Then he froze. His dues had been tripled. Tripled. He stared at the screen for several long seconds, feeling the disbelief settle slowly. She had actually done it. Instead of admitting her mistake about the lake, instead of reviewing the case like she had promised, she had pushed things even further. He closed his eyes and let out a breath through his nose. It wasn't anger exactly. More like disappointment mixed with a quiet understanding. Some people didn't change, but he had changed. And this time, he wasn't going to sit silently. He grabbed his phone, took screenshots of the notice, and then opened the folder containing the old maps and the official deed copies. If she wanted to make things official, he would make things more official than she expected. He drove straight to the county office. The building was quiet. It's the kind of quiet that came with early hours and slow mornings. A woman at the front desk greeted him kindly. He explained the situation, showed her the maps, the deed, the fine, and now the increased dues. She listened carefully, brows raised higher with each part of the story. "Wait," she said slowly. "They tried to fine you for work done on private land. And now they've increased your dues because you challenged it?" "Yes," she sighed. "You're not the first person to have problems with that HOA." It surprised him. "I'm not." She shook her head. "We've had at least 4 complaints in the past year alone." It's that little piece of information woke something inside him. "Do you have records of any of the complaints?" he asked. She nodded. "I can give you dates and general descriptions. Nothing personal or private. I'd appreciate that." She printed a small stack of papers and handed them to him. They weren't detailed, but they were clear enough. Several homeowners had accused the HOA of overstepping, issuing unfair fines, or misinterpreting rules. A pattern. A very clear pattern. He looked through the papers and then looked up at her. If someone wanted to file an official complaint, one that requires a review, what would they need to do? She gave him the form. He filled it out right there, and for the first time since the whole situation began, felt a sense of control returning. He returned home around noon. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed something odd. 3 neighbors were standing near the edge of his property, talking in low voices. They turned when they saw him. One of them walked over. "We all got notices today," the man said. "Our dues went up too?" "What?" he asked sharply. "Not as much as yours," another added, "but enough that people are upset." So, she wasn't just coming after him. She was punishing the entire neighborhood. It was the kind of move a leader made when they feared losing power. "Some people are planning to call a meeting," the first neighbor said. "Without the board?" "A homeowner meeting. You should be there." "When?" he asked. "Tonight." He nodded. "I'll be there." One of them paused and looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, people trust you now. After what happened last night, they listened to you. He didn't quite know how to respond to that. He wasn't used to being the center of anything. He just wanted to live peacefully by his lake. But sometimes, leadership wasn't something you chose. Sometimes it chose you. The meeting was held in someone's backyard. No microphones, no formal setup. Just 20 or so neighbors sitting on folding chairs under the fading evening light. People talked quietly among themselves. Till one of them stood up and said, "We all know why we're here." Heads nodded. Murmurs rose. The neighbor continued, "We need to make a decision. The HOA board isn't acting in our best interest. This dues increase is unfair. The fines they issued this year are unfair. And last night's meeting made things clear they don't want to listen." People turned toward him. He raised his hand slightly. "I'm not trying to lead anything, but I'll tell you what I learned today. The county has multiple complaints filed against the HOA, and after today there's another one, mine." The crowd reacted quickly. "You filed a complaint?" Someone asked, double quotes. "Yes, because they can't change property boundaries. They can't fine people unfairly, and they can't raise dues without proper process." A woman crossed her arms. "I knew they didn't follow process." Someone else spoke up. "We need to replace the board." The word spread through the group like a spark. "Can we even do that?" "Yes," someone said. "There's a clause about a homeowner vote. And how many votes do we need?" He remembered reading that part when he first moved in. 2/3, he said. People exchanged. "Looks, there were about 50 homes in the community. They needed around 34 votes we should talk to." "Everyone," someone said. "We should show them the dues increase." Someone else added, "We should show them the old maps," another neighbor suggested. He nodded. "I can provide copies." The mood shifted. No longer quiet frustration, but real purpose. By the end of the meeting, they had a plan, and he was suddenly part of something much bigger than the lake. Over the next 2 days, neighbors moved from house to house, talking, sharing, listening. Some were cautious, unsure about going against the board. But once they saw the dues increase, the fine issued to him, and the complaints from the county office, most people agreed. The HOA president started noticing the shift long before the official vote was scheduled. She drove around the neighborhood more than usual. She glared at people who gathered in small groups. She sent out emails full of warnings and reminders about HOA rules, but none of it stopped the wave. By the time the vote came, the community center was packed. People whispered. People crossed their arms. People glared at the board. The president opened the meeting with forced calm, but everyone could see the tension. Then came the vote. Homeowners lined up, one by one, to cast their ballot. When the final tally was read, the room erupted. The board had been voted out. Every member, including her. She stood there, frozen as if the air had been punched out of her lungs. But the rules were clear. Once the vote was done, it was done. A new temporary committee was formed to handle things until a full board could be elected. Several neighbors insisted he take a seat, but he shook his head. "I don't want a title," he said softly. "I just want fairness." They respected that. Instead, he was asked to help review old policies and help design new ones, reasonable ones. He agreed. Because if he didn't help now, the same problem could happen again someday. 2 weeks later, he received a letter in the mail. Not a fine, not a threat, a formal notice. Monthly dues adjusted to corrected amount. Previous increase rescinded. He placed the paper on the kitchen counter and let out a soft laugh. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about standing up for himself. It was about standing up for the community. That evening, he walked down to the lake and sat on the small wooden dock. The sun was setting, painting the water in soft shades of orange and gold. He let his feet dangle over the edge. He breathed in the quiet, for the first time in weeks. It felt like his lake again. A neighbor walked over, hands in his pockets. "So," the man said lightly, "looks like justice won." He smiled. "Justice and a little bit of patience. A lot of evidence," the neighbor added with a laugh. They sat together for a moment, watching the water ripple. "You know," the neighbor said, "this whole place feels different now. More relaxed. He nodded. It'll stay that way, long as we all remember what we learned. And what's that? That this place belongs to the people living in it? Not one person trying to control everything. The neighbor nodded thoughtfully before standing up. Glad you didn't give up. He smiled softly. Yeah, me too. When he was finally alone again, he looked out over the lake. His lake hand felt a warmth settle. In his chest, he hadn't just protected his property, he had helped fix his community. And sometimes, that was worth more than anything money could buy. As the last bit of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, he whispered to the quiet water, "Now we can finally breathe."